Dialogue Weekend. August 15th marks the 75th anniversary of Japan's final surrender in World War II. We remember this tragic period in human history. Israel and the UAE agree to normalize relations. How will this deal influence the rest of the Middle East? And this week's newsmaker. Now on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to this edition of Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qinduo. August 15th marks the 75th anniversary of Japan's surrender in World War II. It's been 75 years, but history lingers on, in particular in the Pacific, as Japan strives to become a normal nation, quote unquote, and its neighbors try to reconcile with a painful memory of a brutal Japanese rule. The attempt to whitewash the past and the effort to expand Japanese military capabilities have sparked concerns over a return of militarism. I'm joined by Rong Ying, Vice President of China Institute of International Studies, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics at the East China Normal University, and Takesato Watanabe, Professor Emeritus at Doshisha University. So welcome to the show. We remember history because it's really about us, it's really about today. As we said, despite this long history, the concerns remain about Japan. Let me quote just part of the AP story about today's activity, actually, Saturday. Prime Minister Abe has increasingly sought to whitewash Japan's brutal past since taking office in the end of 2012. He has not acknowledged Japan's wartime hostilities during August 15th speeches, which had previously been a neatly 20-year tradition that began with the 1995 apology by then Prime Minister Tomoichi Murayama. So, Professor Watanabe, let's begin with you. What do you make of this made by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe?
Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's father and grandfather, they are deeply committed to the war, invasion to China, Korea, and some other parts of Asia. So Mr. Abe doesn't know much about the reality, what really happened in Chinese continent, and also how you see the people of Japan were victimized by the military system of Japan. So Mr. Abe and also the Vice Prime Minister Aso, his family also invaded Korea and you see exploited so much through the industries. So those combination of the Prime Minister and Vice Prime Minister of Japan are seriously, ill and no good for the happiness of the world, and also especially relations with other Asian nations for the benefit of the Japanese people and the people of the world, for the world peace.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Mahoney, well, you are in the States. I know the concern mostly is really from Japan's neighbors like China, Korea, South Korea, North Korea, and the Asian countries over there. So do you see there's any reason to be concerned, with the attempt to whitewash the past history or to increase, basically issue no apology about the brutal past?
I think Japan is, and has for a long time, been stuck between a past it can't remember or forget. And given the conditions of its surrender and its agreement not to have a military capable of anything more than defense, it remains too reliant on the United States for security. And anytime it tries to sort of mobilize itself, mobilize its own popular opinion to change this, this policy, it resorts, unfortunately, to nationalism, which then, drags up the negative history of the intersection of nationalism and militarism that led to a lot of the conflict initially with China and Korea, as well as elsewhere. So this is kind of a difficult place for them to be stuck in. And it's, one of the things that I think South Korea, North Korea, as well as China has to be worried about is if, if Japan becomes independent of U.S. policy, then it potentially becomes a threat to them. And if it doesn't, then increasingly the U.S. is trying to drag Japan into stronger and stronger alliances against China in particular. So it's kind of a difficult moment.
Yes, it is a good point over there. We will touch upon that, U.S. factor and the relationship with Japan and its impact in this region. But Rung-Ying, not only the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe issuing no apology, but also, of course, you have at least 4 ministers in his cabinet. They visited the Yasukuni Shrine, which is controversial, which is seen by Asian countries as a symbol of Japanese militarism. So how should we, Chinese, be concerned about, the political trend or the, practice by the Prime Minister and his ministers over there?
Well, I think the history question, I think that facing Japan as a nation, in particular the politicians like Shinzo Abe and other politicians, is a big issue, not only for Japan as a nation itself, but also for peace and stability of the region and the world as a whole. Remember, 75 years ago, after untold sufferings and sacrifice of the countries in the region and beyond, including, I think, Japanese civilians, the war, victory was attained. But for that, good lessons need to learn. That is, say, this war was waged by Japanese military, imperial army, and caused great sufferings to the people. This is the fact. This is the fact that I think cannot be denied or whitewashed. And this is, I think, the fact that has been upheld by the Japanese politicians with insight, including, I think, Prime Minister Murayama and others in their statement. Unfortunately, there had always been politicians that wanted to whitewash or deny the fact of that. That is the reason why countries in the region, including, I think, certainly China, Korea, and also, I think, countries that has been suffered by Japanese aggression during the World War II, had always been very much concerned about that, and should be a concern, I think, as Japan seeking to increase its military capabilities, including, I think, offense capabilities. While so the Japanese politicians, some of them, including, I think, Shinzo Abe and others, have been saying that enough and enough. We have offered apologies many times. I think for me, for countries in the region, it is not the quantity of apologies that make a difference. It is the quantity, in other words, the sincerity of the apology that makes a difference. If Japan politicians keep on, dilly-dally about this, the fact, the history, about the atrocities in the past, in the World War II, that would continue, to be a problem that affects the relationship of Japan with its neighbors. It will continue to be a problem for Japan as it, working to play an important, greater role in the region and beyond.
Well, Professor Watanabe, just following Rung-Ying's comments over there, we do see, there's a lifting of the ban, basically, or the attempt to revise the pacifist constitution and increase in the military capabilities by the Abe administration over there. Are you concerned that, are you worried, whether Japan, somehow the militarism will return to Japan?
I have, and also we have, all more than, you see, 80% of Japanese people are concerned on this point. If the revision of the peace constitution clause, the Japanese, you see, existence, position in the world for the peace is changing so much, and people will not be happy. But fortunately, you see, recent supporting the checking by the radio, TV, and newspapers of Japan, you see, the supporting rate for Abe cabinet is getting down and down, less than 35%. So the power of Mr. Abe and his cabinet is getting smaller and smaller. And today, you know, as you have pointed out already, 4 ministers of Abe cabinet went to Yasukuni Shrine, and Abe himself didn't go, but he asked his friend, the member of the Diet, to bring the money from his private pocket, not governmental money, to the Yasukuni Shrine. But this is a very cunning way, cheating the people of the peace-loving Japanese. So the discussion now inside LDP, you see, Abe's party, government party, this is changeable, this is very flexible, getting weak and weak because, you see, no strong support of the Japanese people.
Right. From that, constitution changes or not, and when it comes to China-Japan relationship, of course, when it comes to Japan, the Second World War, the surrender day, for China, it's really about, we call it like a 14-year anti-Japanese war. This is the commemoration day. So, Rong-Ying, you mentioned about the apology. So is it just for Japan's apology in terms of China-Japan relationship? Or for China, is there something more like a true peace and stability or true reconciliation between the two countries here?
I think, as I said, that for those nations that have been suffered by Japanese Japanese aggressions and the atrocities that has been made by Japanese imperial armies and others, it's not the apology, as I said, per se. Rather, it is the sincerity and the recognition that they have done something wrong, serious wrong, not only to the people of China and people in the region, but also in the people, beyond. Look at the reports that even in UK and the other countries, they are also commemorating the so-called VJ Day, the Victory of Japan Day. And the commemoration of the victory against the Japanese aggression, or the surrender of Japan, is not meant to carry forward hatred. Rather, it is meant to cherish the peace and want to learn a good lesson that peace is so important. Peace is so I think, precious. And I think
that's
yes.
right. It's really about the peace and stability. It's about the future. So, but here's another factor. As Professor Mahoney mentioned earlier, the increasing hostility toward China from Washington, and Japan is a part of the U.S.-Japan alliance, obviously. So there's a concern. Japan somehow will be forced, maybe, pressured by Washington. Because of the, to be more hostile to China. To what degree Japan will act in line with Washington, Professor Mahoney?
I think that's a good question. As our colleague from Japan noted, Abe is facing a difficult and increasingly difficult political position. But in the United States, he also faces an uncertain ally. Trump has taken a very hostile position against China, but it's not certain that Trump will be reelected in November. He's currently lagging in the polls given the tremendous failure of Washington's response to COVID-19. And, you know, I don't think that, the other side of this is that while Biden may continue to have some anti-China component to his foreign policy, he's also likely to de-escalate some of the tensions. I don't think it's in Tokyo's interest to have an open conflict with China, at least not the way that Washington has escalated it. So, you know, Japan is facing, Abe's government is facing a lot of pressure, both from its own difficult domestic politics, but also through the uncertainty of its ally remaining in power, and whether or not that's even a good thing for Japan at this point, given the danger of escalation that Trump represents. So, you know, we'll see how this shakes out over the next several months.
Well, let's move on to the Middle East. The United Arab Emirates has reached a deal with Israel to normalize their relationship. The agreement makes the UAE the third Arab nation after Egypt and Jordan to establish diplomatic ties with Israel. It is hailed as a historic step for peace in the region, but also condemned by others as the move may further weaken the position of the Palestinians. To tell us more about the developing story, we have Mayor Javandafa, a Middle East analyst. So welcome to the show, Mr. Javandafa. So Israel and the UAE, so they have agreed to the full normalization of their relationship. Are you surprised by the move?
To be honest with you, I'm surprised they announced it. I mean, this has been going on. Relations have been going on between the two countries secretly since the early 2000s. I remember hearing about it as early as 2006, 2007, and there have been many Israelis traveling to the UAE. As you know, Israel is a country of immigrants, so we have many people who can have double passports, you know, from the countries which their parents immigrated from. So they've been traveling to the UAE using various different passports. I would say the numbers probably run into hundreds of thousands, but this has been kept really in the secret channels. It wasn't in the open, which is amazing in the era of social media. So many people manage to keep their mouths shut. That's quite an achievement for Israelis, I have to tell you, as an Israeli. But you know, I was surprised that they've come out now. Why now? You know, I was surprised. I was thinking maybe it could be another time when there's some kind of development in Israeli-Palestinian relations. Then we could see the UAE coming as a reward to Israel, coming and announcing this news. But no, it was a bolt out of the blue, let me tell you, and it was I can tell you, in the Middle East, where we have a serious drought of good news, it was very good news. I'm very happy about it. So,
okay, you know, so what's the index for UAE? You know, like reportedly, officially, you know, people say UAE hopes to limit Iran's power in the region because obviously there's a common enemy between Israel and the UAE. So is this the purpose?
As an Iranian Israeli, I was born in Iran. Let me tell you that there are many Iranians who live in the UAE. There's great trade going on, but the UAE they're kind of deterred by the behavior of the by the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic of Iran. They feel concerned about its support for Hezbollah. They feel concerned about its support for Hamas. They are very concerned about the Iranian influence in Yemen, which is very important to the UAE and its allies. Saudi Arabia. So I think that's one of the reasons why they've been cooperating with Israel, but that's not the biggest reason. Let's not make that mistake. There are other reasons. There are two very important reasons. One of them is bilateral trade between the two countries. We have a lot of technology to offer to the Emiratis, and they have a lot of financial services and financing that they can offer to us, and that's very important. Another very important factor for the UAE is that if you have good relations with Israel, many doors are open to you in Washington. So that's another important reason why they are doing this. You know, thanks to the Jewish American community, anybody who has good relations with Israel, because of the influence that AIPAC and other organizations, lobbying organizations have, life becomes much easier especially a Middle Eastern country that has good relations with the State of Israel. So I think that's another reason why the UAE have decided to start this process with Israel.
So what's in it for Israel? You know, many people say this is a big victory for Israel or for Prime Minister Netanyahu. But is this conditional on at least the suspension of the annexation of West Bank?
Look, Mr. Netanyahu knows that he can't continue with annexation. So this, you know, he managed to leverage it to his credit. He managed to leverage it to get at least the UAE to declare that they want to have diplomatic relations with Israel. We know annexation is not going to happen now, and probably not in the future. Although, you know, don't say never in this region. You know, annexation. It seems that President Trump doesn't want annexation. For President Trump, he doesn't want to disrupt his relations with the Middle Eastern countries who are against annexation, and I'm talking about Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf Cooperation Council, Bahrain, and others. So, you know, this was a victory for Mr. Netanyahu. But there are two very important things that it won't change. Number one, it won't change the need for us and the Palestinians to sit down and talk to each other. You know, this is key. Anybody who thinks that now Israel can ignore this and can just walk away from the Palestinians, they're illusion. They're lying to themselves, whether they're Israelis or Palestinians. This is very important. And the other issue is that it won't improve. It won't have a long-lasting improvement on the popularity of Mr. Netanyahu, because what the people of Israel are judging him right now is his management of the COVID-19, which hasn't been very impressive. And also there are 3 files opened against him, and he's being tried in Israeli courts. And this is very important. So I don't think this achievement, as much as it is an important achievement, is going to stop people demonstrating outside the residence of Prime Minister Netanyahu in Jerusalem.
Well, you know, by brokering this deal, Mr. Trump, the President Trump, has pulled off a real victory for U.S. diplomacy in the Middle East, you know, ahead of this general election. So, Professor Mahoney, in the past we have been hearing about this grand deal between Israelis and the Palestinians, but now it's really about forging diplomatic ties between UAE and Israel. So, what's in it for President Trump?
Well, I think that President Trump has claimed this as a major foreign policy victory, and he hasn't had, remarkably, despite you know, intervening in a lot of dramatic ways in foreign policy, he doesn't have much to show for that. From my perspective, this is really about 2 leaders, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, who are in trouble. Netanyahu's in trouble, as was noted, legally, and as well with his COVID-19 response. And also, you know, he ran his last election on the promise of annexation, which was, you know, he kind of painted himself into a corner because that was going to cause all sorts of trouble, given that it's an illegal act. So this is really, I think, a gift from UAE for Trump and Netanyahu at a time when both men really need a helping hand, particularly in Trump's case, as he's stumbling towards November, trying to be reelected. So in this sense, I agree that although it's being made a very big deal by Netanyahu and by Trump, it's really just normalizing, as was noted, what had been basically extensive clandestine, but openly clandestine ties since the early part of the new century.
Well, let's put aside a little bit of this new development, and let's take a look at this week's newsmaker here. So the U.S. Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden has picked California Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate for the upcoming election. So what are his considerations of, what Harris has in her to help Joe Biden to win the election, Professor Mahoney?
Well, I think she has quite a number of qualities, strong qualities, but there are four that really deserve to be mentioned above all others. The first is that she's really, among the other potential running mates, she's probably the one who demonstrated in her own run for the presidency or the presidential nomination, the one that's demonstrated that she's most ready for the national stage. She is a skilled debater. She will be able to, if we end up having debates, given the strange circumstances of the pandemic, I think she'll handle Mike Pence quite well. The second point is she's quite tough, and it's generally part of the campaign that a vice presidential candidate is one who takes stronger attacking positions, and it seems likely that she'll be able to fulfill that role very strongly. Mm-hmm. Third, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, Rong-Ying, Harris has many strengths, obviously, in her, but, people question, is she progressive enough to accommodate the left side of the Democratic Party?
You want my view?
Yes.
Well, that's what the third point was that I think she...
Okay, Professor Mahoney, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think ultimately she will appeal to both centrist and progressive factions. I think the progressive factions will mobilize around her, particularly given the alternative in Donald Trump. And I think in part she will help mobilize the progressive factions, and I think she'll help mobilize both women and minorities, even perhaps better than Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rong-Ying, if elected, Harris will become the first woman and the first black vice president in U.S. history. So how much is the choice of Harris, about the upcoming election, and how much is it about the future of the Democratic Party, maybe?
Oh, indeed. It seems that it's the pick of Senator Kamala Harris is a quite popular or very popular sort of a choice, a wise decision, as being, I think it is believed that it would reinforce the advantageous positions of Joe Biden in the coming general elections. And of course, as Professor Mahoney said, there are a lot of qualities or a lot of things that it can bring to Joe Biden's campaign. But in the end, I think as far as I can see that winning the election it still has some 2.5 months to go. And in the end, if the past history can be a reference, I think the voters will largely decide their vote, how to cast a vote, based on I think the president, the candidate of president and its agenda. So I think if Senator Harris could help reinforce or make a better case for Joe Biden's campaign to improve the governance, and particularly I think the economy, and also fighting the COVID-19, and that would be a big, I think indeed will prove a good and wise decision.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Rong-Ying. With that, we are coming to the end of the show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. You can follow me on Twitter, Xu Qinduo. Thank you for your time. See you next week.